Sige, I'll just give a brief background about myself for those who don't know. Next slide there. So, I've been doing web development for almost exclusively for startups for the last 7, 8 years. I've used .NET, PHP, and since the last 4 years, I've been using Ruby. I've been using both Rails and some other frameworks such as Ramatzi, which we used to build one of our startups before. Currently, I'm the tech guy at a company called Scrambled Eggs that's building an iOS app, which I'll talk about later. And I also teach at Ateneo. I teach database. One of my students is here. But eventually, we'll also be teaching Ruby in Ateneo. So you might expect some visitors that are students from our school. You may also know me from Frog. I've been to some meetups, pero the last meetup I went to that was like 6-7 months ago. Usually nandun ako sa mga Frog na inuman. That's why I know sila. Alright, and then Startup Weekend. I also run Deep Camp with Cat Pen. It's a yearly event. It's sort of like a tech meetup. It happens in Baguio. This year it will be May something. Okay, I'll update you guys on that. Hopefully you guys can come. Okay, so let's go to let's talk about my topic. My topic today is building. Okay, okay na yan. Okay na yan. Building mobile APIs using Ruby. Because we're all Ruby programmers here. Obviously, this is the Ruby users group. So I just want to talk about my experience with building an API for the app that we're building called Duets. Duets is a turn-based karaoke app. So how it works is I would sing part of a song, send it to my friend, my friend would sing the other part of the song, send it back to me, and then it would get combined into one record. It would be just like you were singing in the same room. So obviously that needs a server component to sync everything into one project or sync everything into one record. So we use Ruby for that technology. Okay, briefly gonna talk about history of, I guess, apps. Let's just go to the next slide. Okay, so recently, a lot of work in the development space or in the industry, I guess, is moving towards mobile apps. Everyone has an app nowadays. Even Vicky Bello has her own app, right? If you haven't seen it, try to download it. But yeah, everyone's been asking, asking us developers to build mobile apps for them. So I guess 1 year ago, I shifted from being a web person or a web developer and moved on to building mobile apps. Next slide. Yep, so as I was saying, recently everyone's been doing mobile. This is because of the new changes, not just in infrastructure, where it's easy to get data on your mobile. It's also due to the fact that there's just more devices, they're getting cheaper and cheaper. So, what does that mean for people who are still doing web development? Okay, it seems like people no longer need us. Okay, a lot of people are shifting to becoming mobile developers. Next slide. Luckily, as you still need some sort of web component or server component to support all of these mobile applications or mobile clients. Like even Facebook, the Facebook iOS app would need a mobile component. Twitter iOS app would need a mobile component. And of course, our app, our singing app, needs a server component in order to sync up all those turns. So, it's good because we're still needed in this new space or in this new era of technology. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the approach that I used when I was starting to build the server stuff for our mobile app was to think about it in terms of a rich internet application. So you guys have built rich internet applications before. Basically just any app that uses Ajax or maybe Flash, anything that is as responsive as a desktop application. And you guys know that's simply just writing more client-side code, right? Just writing more code into your front end which accesses similar stuff or which accesses the data that's found in your back end. So this is Ria. I know what to Ria. She's a reporter. So I just threw her in there because of the word Ria. So yeah, that mindset of building mobile apps is sort of the same as the mindset that you would need when you're building a rich internet application. So as we know, it's sort of a client-server model where in a rich internet application, your client, essentially your browser, would request things via Ajax, via Flash, would request data from your server in order to do its client stuff. Okay? So it's just the same with your mobile app. Internet.
Uy, nakasara torrent ko.
Try mo nga ba?
Ba, ito yung ayaw mo i-load ng slide.
Back mo ba?
Ha?
Back mo. Back.
May isang slide din na mag-load.
Forward mo nila. Okay. There's this story I read about that I got this from Jim Ison of Smart DevNet. I would just suggest that you go to that link and read about it. It's basically finding what makes a successful API or what makes a good API. The bottom line is that you have to know the native wisdom of today's mobile world. And the native wisdom is that your APIs will support and strengthen your mobile apps. Again, just like in the example of our singing app, it couldn't work or it won't work without that essential server component that does all of that stitching of the songs or of the turns that were being sang or that were sent from our clients. Okay, next slide. Okay, so again, going back to how mobile apps are structured, you're just treating your mobile apps as clients that connect to your server via the same protocol, via HTTP. Okay, does it just requests data in the same way that your Ajax apps do. So the mindset is still the same. If you're a web developer, it should be pretty easy to transition into being a mobile developer. Okay. But what the main focus of my talk today is to talk about this part. How to effectively build the server part to support your mobile app. Using, of course, the Ruby technologies that we love. Okay, so how do you actually build your APIs? Building APIs is just like building any other web application. Or if you think about it's just like building another Rails app. You'll have your models, you'll have your views, you'll have your controllers. It's just that in this case, the people or the audience of your API is not your end user. The audience of your API is your mobile client. Okay, so it will be machines or programs that will be using the web app that you are building. Okay? But again, the mindset, the process is still the same. If you can build a web app, then you can build an API. Just like any other web app, the transfer or the protocol used is via HTTP or via HTTPS. If you want it to be more secure. Ideally, what you want to do is to plan what format your client will consume, whether that will be JSON, XML. So, whether or not your API is going to be in REST, and you also have to take into account what capabilities your mobile client has to parse the data that you are sending to it. Okay? Of course, all the other concerns that you have with web applications or web programs like scalability, you also, or you would still need to take those into account. Things like sessions and authentication, again, just remember that your audience is another program or a non-human. Okay? So you would need to think about smart ways how to handle sessions and authentication. Luckily, we have device for Ruby, so a lot of those are already easily handled by us. Okay. So the idea or the technique, I guess, that we used when we were planning out how to build our mobile app was to sort of use a design by contract strategy, where we designed or planned exactly what the API would give to our mobile client so that the mobile client knows what to expect from the API, and we did this before building anything. Okay, so we planned out how the mobile client would interact with our API. So this allowed us to develop them at the same time, or at least in parallel. The mobile client didn't need to wait or didn't need to depend on me to finish my server stuff before they could start development. So the idea is just to maintain a contract between your mobile client and your web API by defining that interface of how they connect. So that relates as well to picking your format, picking whether or not you'll be using REST, or whatever other design considerations you want to do when you are planning your app. Okay, another thing to take note of is, again, since the audience of our web apps or of our API is non-human, then there's no quick way for us to visually test it. Normally, if you're doing web apps, you would test it by opening it on the browser and checking if it works. Now with your API, it's not that simple, since the intended audience isn't really a browser. The intended audience is someone who is going to make a HTTP request and return some data. So I just used a gem for testing called REST client to do a REST request onto my API. There's also some Chrome and Firefox extensions that allow you to do the same thing. You can also do a simple curl request. Okay? All you really need to do is test that those endpoints, that interface that you defined in your API works. Okay? So now we've designed our API, we've planned it out by creating that interface, and we also have a strategy to test our API. So, the natural tendency for a lot of Ruby people is to build it with Rails, because Rails is one of the most fashionable frameworks today. Right? Like, who here uses Rails? I guess almost everybody. The good thing about it, or the good thing about Rails, is that it already supports some kind of RESTful architecture. So you already know that it will support REST. If you want your client to use a REST interface, then Rails, you can easily do it with Rails. Rails also already supports multiple formats. If you wanted your client to consume JSON, if you wanted your client to consume XML, you can easily do that with Rails. You can use Rails testing framework for testing your API easily. Again, without using your browser. And there's a variety of existing gems, existing technology that already works with Rails. Okay? Kasi nga, fashionable siya. But, next slide. I have a few issues with Rails. Okay, not in general. I have a few issues with it for use in my APIs. Because for the original API of our app, we actually built it in Rails. Okay, so these issues are, so Rails, as you know, has a lot of dependencies that aren't really needed for your purpose. Huh? Like, it has, what do you call this? Some modules, I guess, for displaying proper formats on your browser, or for maintaining, I guess, a client session. You don't really need this, or there's a lot of things that you won't need since the API is actually much simpler than your standard web application. Although you can ideally cherry pick or set up Rails in such a way that it works for APIs, that is such a hassle. Okay? And then there's other issues which I won't go into. You can just visit this link. So I'll post a link to this slide set on my Twitter after this talk. Okay. But fortunately, a lot of people have also tried to build APIs with Rails, and they've built a few gems to help with that process. Again, to support that entire process of mobile client building. So there's Rabble, which is a your Ruby API builder language, which is sort of used for the view layer, so that it's easy to generate data that can readily be consumed by your mobile apps. And then there's a version of Rails, or there's I guess a fork of Rails called Rails API that is that cherry-picked version of Rails, okay, that was intended for building APIs. But my issue with this is I don't think it's maintained anymore. Okay. So, next slide. So, I am a big advocate of Microframeworks. If you're a Rails developer and haven't tried at least one Microframework, I suggest you do. So you have these other options. Since your mobile API is a much simpler web application, you can also use a much simpler framework like Sinatra, Gramatsi, Merb, or Camping. And you only build what you need, exactly just that interface that you define for your mobile app. For most of these micro-frameworks, you'll need to know Ruby really well. Okay? If you think about it, that's actually a good thing. So if you're learning Ruby now, or if you've been using Rails for a while and haven't really got out of that whole Rails ecosystem, I suggest you try some kind of micro-framework. Alright, so the natural tendency for me, since I am a micro-framework user, from Rails we moved to, or we tried to look for a micro-framework that would suit our needs for API development. So next slide. So, we found this framework by Andrei, very respectable Ruby Rails company, called Grape. And Grape is a micro-framework that's specifically built for APIs. Okay? It's specifically built for that use case, for creating something that will be consumed by other clients. So Grape stands for Generalized Rapid API Erector. Okay. Okay, excellent. Okay, so in order to create your API using the Grape framework, it's as simple as this. It's as simple as defining that interface, like hello, and then telling what verb you want to use to access that interface, and then returning some data in the form of either JSON or XML. Okay, so that's it. That's a simple API. So obviously you can just extend that to conform or to build the entire interface that your mobile app will consume. It's rack-based, so it's easily deployed. And it can you can mount it alongside your Rails app since it's rack-based. Actually, a lot of the people I've run into who use Grape, they just mount it alongside their Rails application. So if their Rails application needs an API, they just made a separate mounting of a Grape application inside the routes file. Okay, so it has all the standard stuff like supporting different content types, all the standard HTTP stuff. It has a feature called entities, which allows you to group your data when you are presenting it to your mobile client. Because naturally, if you think in the MVC model or MVC pattern, then you would logically group your data into hierarchies or logically group your data into resources. Entities allows you to easily do this within the Grape Framework. Now, what I like about the Grape Framework is a feature called API versioning. So, normally, it would happen in a traditional web development environment is you have all your developers with their dev copies of the code. You have a staging copy that should always work. And then you have your production copy that is your client-facing copy of your website or of your application. So in a web app, in a client-facing or human-facing web app, this is pretty simple. You just test your things on staging, and then once everything is good in staging, you move it on to production. And your end users will now get your updates or will now get those fixes done by your developers. Now in doing mobile apps, there's, I guess, a semi-issue that you have to go through. If you're familiar with the Apple ecosystem, you have to submit your app into a review process that can usually take 6 days to 1 week before it shows up in the App Store. So, what does that tell us? That tells us that, okay, obviously you need to have a dev copy of your API so that you can write it, you can add code to it. Now, you also need a staging copy of your API so that you can test it internally within your company. But once you submit to Apple, they also need to be able to access your API in order for them to test your mobile app. And then once they've approved it, that goes to production. Obviously, in a real-world scenario, you can have one copy of your app that's already in production, already given to users. Okay? And then there's one copy of your app that's in queue for review in the App Store. So obviously, those have to have different servers, or those need to connect to different APIs, since the version that you are asking Apple to check might not support the version that's already in production, or the version that's already being used by your end users. So, what we did was we have a dev version, we have a staging version, we have a staging version specifically for the App Store, and then we have a production version. Okay. So how does if you think about that in the context of a Rails app, then that's several copies that would be a hassle to maintain. So next slide. So how you do it in Grape is that you just define a version, okay? So that if a client has a specific version, it will just tell the API what version it's using, and the API will return that specific data or the specific compatible data to it when it requests it. So let's say this version is for the production version, this version is for the App Store review version. So for that use case, obviously that's really useful. It's even more useful when you think about people who are using your application, and some of them might not have an updated version of your app. Obviously, their app that they're holding still needs to work. Otherwise, you lose a customer. So, by having this versioning, it allows you to have different mobile clients that run different versions of your app and still work with the same API, still work with the same data. And this is what brought us to Grape. This is why we picked Grape over any other framework, because it allowed us to do this. And it allowed us to easily get around that app store, that multiple client problem. Okay, so some recommendations for building your API. Obviously, you guys know how to do MVC. We'll talk about that. We use device so that we didn't have to think about all those authentication problems or authentication issues. We didn't need to custom build our authentication. So we just use token-based authentication on device. I also prefer to use some gems just to make your API more responsive, just to make it faster. I use OJ for JSON parsing and building JSON. I use OX for XML generation and XML parsing. Okay, no. So, any questions? Our app is called Duets. It's available on the Philippine App Store. So, please download it because I need to get to a certain number of downloads before I can cut my hair. So, please help me cut my hair. We just recently got cleared for licenses for international songs. So if any of you are One Direction fans or Backstreet Boys fans, download our app or visit our app or get our app in the next 2 weeks, and you'll be able to sing your favorite One Direction songs. Yeah. So, Duets, it's in the App Store.
Yung balik mo nga the last code snippet.
Okay, sige.
What if, anyway, I just asked as Terrence moves this slide, what if you said there were many versions for, say, a specific controller method. What if there's a bug that's existed on multiple versions?
What if there's a bug that exists?
That exists on multiple versions?
You need to fix it on multiple versions, or because you design your application in such a way that you try to separate things as much as possible. For example, you designed it in an MVC way. It's easy to, if for example, it's easy to move all that logic that could be buggy, move it to your model so that it applies for all your clients. But of course, that happens, and if it's a bug affecting all versions, then you need to fix all versions. Right? That's sort of a trade-off. But I guess the peace of mind it gives that at least any version will work. Okay, is there.
Does it get
Long.
long?
What we do is we also have analytics on our mobile app, so we know what versions are logging in. So once we see that a version is no longer being used, we just delete it from the code base, or at least remove it so that our code gets more maintained. Right now there's 6 versions, and you don't need to do this for all your interfaces. For example, for one of your interfaces, nothing changed, then don't add a version number for it. That will, all client requests will go to that interface, and it will be okay, since it will work for all clients. Like for example, your login. Our login hasn't really changed from day one. So our login doesn't have this code. It's just our get token, post token, does that. So you just need to do this for things that change a lot. during your development. And for us, that's the part where you send a turn to the server. Alright. Any other questions?
By the way, I just installed your app. Yeah. Because we have this, we already have a web app, and now we are branching off or creating a mobile version of it. And of course, we already written some business model on our Rails. Now, if we are to use Rail, can we import those business logic? Because what we are trying to avoid is
Rewriting.
it.
So like I said, you can mount your Grape app alongside your Rails app. That's as simple as adding a line to your routes file. Now, if you just include all those Rails files, like I'm sure you can use your models from your Rails application. I'm sure you can use your models.
Ay, sorry.
Okay? So, a lot of your logic should be on your models anyway. Okay? Questions?
Chika daw, Dre.
Ha? Okay. Thanks. Please download our app.
Chick daw yung nagsasalita. Chick daw yung nagsasalita.